This video is a plan to wrap up the epoxy bathroom series. I'm going to do a little bit here on the benches I'm making and then a lot of lessons learned. So the top for the benches, I'm taking a different method than I took when I did the walls, where I basically let the epoxy run over all the edges and smoothed it out. For the benches, I am basically building a mold. And one of the reasons I'm doing this is to see if that would have been a better way to do the walls. So I have a sheet of melamine just left over from another concrete desk project, but you don't need a whole sheet. I could have just built corners. So this bottom sheet doesn't have to go all the way across depending on how you do your wall. In this case, I want the bottom and the tops done because it's something that's going to get splashed on the bottom and the top. But for the walls, you would have only done the top and edges, so could have built some basically some angle iron, quote unquote angle wood, out of melamine. I lined all the edges and the bottom actually here with Tyvek tape. I'll put down a layer on the bottom, and then I'm dropping my bench in, which is 3/4 inch plywood that's been primed, and I've got an 1/8 of an inch all the way around the edges, so that when I pour this epoxy in on top, it's going to encase this piece of plywood completely in epoxy. So it's basically a plywood core epoxy pour. The benches are going to be the inverse of the walls. So the walls are white with silver marbling. The benches are going to be silver with white marbling. So there's the base layer. It's been setting for about 4 hours. It's good and tacky. I've dropped one side in. I'm going to drop the other side in, mix the epoxy up, and pour it. It came out a lot darker than I thought it would. It's beautiful. I just don't know how much it's going to match with the rest of the bathroom. But I should have perfect edges all the way around that I can just sand on a tiny bit to get them perfectly smooth and clear coat them. So this should be a really nice presentation piece that's sitting on top of the bench. The bases are right there. They're just made out of plywood. They've been coated in Red Guard with 4 coats to be waterproof, and then 4 coats of Kills to get them white, and then I'm going to paint them a light silver before I put them in. So that's it for right now. We'll be back in 24 hours to demold this. Did have an issue I've never had before. Maybe somebody else who does epoxy can give me some insight, but this plywood core right here wanted to float on me. The edges wouldn't fill up, and I noticed that the board was actually getting higher, and so I had to screw the board down to my mold. The screw heads are covered under the epoxy, and then when I get ready to demold this, I'm going to have to cut the screws off from the bottom. So this side didn't do it. I've never had that problem before, so if anybody's ever seen that, let me know in the comments what causes it. And the benches are in. They're a little darker than I wanted them to be, but I still think they look okay. So I guess the last thing I was going to do in this video was kind of some lessons learned. There were a lot of lessons learned on this door and shower rod. I covered those in the shower door video, so I won't talk about those. If I had this to do all over again, would I still do it? Absolutely. I love the fact that there are no grout lines, that I don't have to worry about this thing being sealed or weeping through. So definitely happy with that, even though it costs more than tile would have. Things I would do different. This big panel here was made exponentially harder by the decision to bond the window seals on and the shower caddy in before I epoxied it, so that there wouldn't be a seam. And it looks pretty good, and I definitely don't have a seam, but knowing what I know now about how well you can seal seams using the epoxy itself and it's still waterproof, I probably wouldn't do it again because it made this panel so much harder. I would probably make this wall come out the thickness of the board on the side, so that I would have a seam right here and seal that with epoxy. And then I would probably actually have the window ledge stick out more like a traditional window ledge, about 1 inch. And then I would seal it in the corner and from the bottom with the epoxy. And then I would have the shower caddy drop in. So I would make it as a box and seal all the corners with epoxy. And then I would make like a picture frame around it and seal that, and then slide the whole thing in and then just seal it with epoxy around the edges. Would have made that panel way easier. The two side panels, the things that gave me issues there were pre-drilling the holes for everywhere I was going to come through, and then filling that with epoxy, and then epoxying the beauty coat. Because the issue that I ran into was that I used the quick set epoxy, and it thickens, it expands as it dries. And so after I poured those pucks, they were proud. They stuck up about 1/8 of an inch above the surface. And so I had to try and sand them down. And then when I sanded them down, since it was foam, it was very easy to dig into the foam with the sanding block. And I actually wound up with dips, which then, when I put my structural coat on with quick set epoxy, it expanded and became high spots again. So I think the number one takeaway from that long ramble was I would not use the quick set epoxy for anything other than gluing panels together. Because of the way it spans, it doesn't auto level or self level, and it self levels if you have a perfectly level surface. But if you have a surface that's not level, it can't be used to level a surface. And you're almost never going to have a perfectly level surface unless you have a panel that you haven't had to cut at all. But these panels here, even if I hadn't pre-cut all the holes for where everything was going to come through, I did have to cut and reinforce with plastic or wood where the shower rod mounted. I couldn't just leave that foam. So I was never going to have a perfectly flat virgin panel. So I would not have used the quick set epoxy for anything other than gluing the panels together. If I had to do this all over again, I would have still pre-drilled the holes, and then I would have used regular thickened epoxy to fill the holes and screeded them level with some kind of body filler paddle or something like that. And then I would have just let it sit for about 4-5 hours is usually what a seal coat runs at. It gets tacky after that. Then I would have put my structural coat on. I would have used regular epoxy for the structural coat. I would have put the thickener in it because the thickener gives it a lot of strength. I'd have put the fiberglass mat in it. And then another 4 or 5 hours later, you could have poured your beauty coat. So you could still do a panel in a day. You would do any holes you wanted to fill, any like bonding in reinforcement pieces. You could do all that first thing in the morning. After lunch, you can put your structural coat on. After dinner, you can pour your beauty coat, and the next morning it's ready to go. The floor is another thing I would probably do a little bit differently. I've got too much texture in it. It's really great for grip, but I can already tell it is going to be a nightmare to clean. I'm definitely going to have a bristled brush to clean down in all the little grooves. So I probably should have thickened the epoxy a little less so that I wound up with less texture when I rolled it out with the roller. The other issue, or not issue, but thing I would have done differently is if you notice on this end, my bronze is very brown and bold and my gray is pretty bold. And then when you come down to this end, it's much lighter. And that's because I was mixing up such small amounts of the silver and the copper that I was really having a hard time getting this exact same amount of powder into it every time, the mica powder. And so I wound up with darker, and then my floor wound up really dark there on that threshold. So if I had it to do all over again, you don't need a lot of your marbling or your veins. I probably used less than 8 ounces of bronze and definitely less than you know, a half gallon of the silver, I would have actually taken my part A, which is the resin, not the catalyst. I would have measured out about how much I thought I needed of each, maybe 50% extra. And I would have go ahead and mix them with powder and colored them right then and just had them sitting there. And so every time I needed some silver, I would have poured some already mixed silver part A, poured the part B in, the catalyst, mixed it up, and that way every batch would have had the exact same amount of silver and copper pigment in it. And so I would have had very consistent secondary colors on all of my panels. It still looks okay. I mean, it's supposed to look like marble, which is a natural stone, and so it's always got variations in it. But I do wish it was a little more consistent. I think the other thing I probably would have done differently if I were to do this again has to do with the placement of everything. I feel like these shower heads are too far to the middle. I would have pushed them back a little bit. And I probably should have had more storage or rack space. You see, I actually had to put some wires up, some racks up, because I didn't have enough built in. But those are the big ones. I would avoid the quick set epoxy. I would try not to modify my panels any more than I had to until I got them in. So that would mean doing more bonding in the shower rather than pre-bonding things outside. And I would have pre-mixed my colors with just the part A so that I would have had consistent colors. So thanks guys for checking it out, and if you've got any questions or suggestions, feel free to leave them in the comments.